Wafube, peace and blessings. This is Misael Bay, aka Warlock Asylum, coming at you once again with another episode of the Simon Necronomicon lessons. Always have to pause at that last moment because I'm so used to introducing raw talk. So today we're going to talk about how Nimrod of biblical fame evolved into Yahweh. Okay, so that I've been promising to do this discussion for a long time, and I want to get, I decided to knock it out the way. Someone had actually left a comment. I have to respond to them about the video, and I decided to do the video and send them the link when it's done. Before we begin, we also want to give great honors to Santa Muerte, and let us continue on in this biblical discussion. This was definitely one of the things that, I discovered that really changed my perspective spiritually and, just in life and the viewpoint of certain theological groups and religion, okay? There's a lot of things throughout the entire Bible that, people read the Bible every day and they never consider asking questions. And the questions that they do ask are often predisposed, or they're given questions to ask through literature. I've seen people publish literature about, does the Bible contradict itself, and put out a list of contradictions that are not the real contradictions, but to the person who's, has hope, it sort of reassures their confidence. But when you really read, some of the passages and stuff, it's really interesting. And before we begin, I want to just point out a couple of things in biblical allure that led me to this discovery, which is confirmed by anthropologists, some, and also some historians and some theologians concerning Nimrod and his evolution as the deity Yahweh. Before we begin, I want to point out a couple of things. Give me 1 second. I want to just highlight a few things on my page here. I want to share some things with you that I found in the quote-unquote good book that was quite disturbing. Okay, let me see. We'll take it from the book of Genesis. I believe in this section, it will be Genesis chapter 2. Don't quote me on that. Let's get to Genesis chapter 2 first. I didn't outline any of this. I thought it'd probably just be better just to go straight in, So, because sometimes, you come up with things that's better. And other discussions, I would try to, format a little bit more preparation, okay? But today, fortunately, the references that I do share, I will be sharing those references with us live, and we get a chance to see. It's a possibility that the God of the Bible could be an adversarial force. Definitely to indigenous people and people of color, he was put in a position to destroy them. And you will see that when we share a couple of scriptures. Okay, so the first text that I would like to share is in the book of Genesis, chapter 2, verses 8. And I'm going to share my screen on this one. Okay, hold on a second. Genesis 2, here we go. Okay, in the screen share, you can see in Genesis chapter 2, verses 8. And this is the King James Version. It's evident in every version. Some people may have different versions. And you can look at those and you can find out the same facts. It's not a word play. It's not something lost in translation. This is actually how it's stated. Now, to some people, this may seem to be very simple in the beginning, but let's look a little further. And the Lord formed the man of the dust. I'm sorry, I'm going to go to chapter 2, verses 7 to 8. And it says, and the Lord formed man of the dust of the ground and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and man became a living soul. Verses 8, and the Lord planted a garden eastward in Eden, and there he put the man whom he had formed. Okay, let me stop sharing that. So we can see that not all of Eden was a garden, but the eastward in Eden was a garden. Now that's very important, and here's why. When we go back into, let me just get to another chapter. I believe it is chapter 4. Let me just get, okay, it is. It's Genesis chapter 4. Now, people are familiar with most of Genesis, at least the first preliminary chapters, right? Let me just get my screen back up. They're familiar with the preliminary chapters of Genesis and the story about the Bible account and everything. Now, as we just saw, the Lord planted a garden in the east of Eden, eastward in Eden, right? So after that, there was a situation that man was told not to eat of a certain tree. The woman that Adam was given was seduced. She ate from the tree. The tree was probably figurative of certain things. And they were driven out the garden. And then they were prevented. They couldn't even go back in the garden. And then in the Bible, it says that man may not reach out and take from the tree of life and live the times immortal. We got to remove this, stuff or whatever. So we're taught that man never made it back to Eden. And the Garden of Eden was in the east of Eden, as we saw in the first chapter. Soon afterwards, Cain and Abel were the first children born to the couple, as we're told. And what happens to Cain is that he kills his brother. But the Lord intervenes and makes sure that Cain is given lifetime protection. Whoever strikes Cain will be avenged 77 times, 7 times 7, however it goes. But here's what's interesting about this whole account. Let's take a look at where Cain was banished to. I'll share my screen once again. Here we go. And it says, okay, they talk about Cain and Abel. This is chapter 4. And let me see if I can find the verse. Yes, the verse is verse 14 through 17. Now, let's take this into consideration. Behold, thou hast driven me out this day from the face of the earth, and from thy face shall I be hid. And I shall be fugitive and a vagabond in the earth. And it shall come to pass that everyone that findeth me shall slay me. And the Lord said unto him, therefore, whosoever slayeth Cain, vengeance shall be taken on him sevenfold. And the Lord set a mark upon Cain, lest any finding him should kill him. Okay, so we see that the Lord, after Cain killed his own brother, if we were to take these scriptures literally, the Lord placed protection on him. So the first, according to the Bible, Cain was the first murderer. And as the first murderer, he was protected by the God of the Bible as the first murderer. But here's where it gets really interesting. In verse 16, it says, and Cain went out from the presence of the Lord and dwelt in the land of Nod on the east of Eden. So wait a minute. The Garden of Eden was in the east of Eden. And Cain, after he killed his brother, he was given lifetime protection by the Lord of the Bible. And he was said to dwell in the east of Eden, where the Garden of Eden was originally placed. It gets more interesting. And Cain knew his wife, and she conceived and bore Enoch. And he built a city and called the name of the city after the name of his son Enoch. So the first Enoch was not the seventh descendant of Adam, but was actually Cain's son, was the first Enoch recorded in the Bible. And this is possibly where Enochian magic and mysticism comes from, not from the Enoch that was so-called the prophet that God took. And why would this prophet be named after Cain's first son, who built a city with the same name, is a question. Or how could he build a city when there's only like 6 people on earth? Is another question. See what I'm saying? So people who read the Bible daily, they don't always ask questions because they're told what to read, and they never look beyond the verses. People have read these verses for years, and no one has ever asked, why was Cain sent to the east of Eden, where in chapter 2 it tells us that the Garden of Eden was in the east of Eden? No one ever asked that question. Very, very interesting. So there's something else that actually came up out of this that I did want to touch on, but it doesn't come to mind at the time. I'm gonna go into what I did want to share with y'all concerning Yahweh, So, okay, I'm gonna point out the book, and then I'm gonna read an excerpt from the book because actually it's a free book online. Let me see if I can find the Amazon link, and I can show y'all. What this is. I'm not sure why it's not coming up on. Oh, I know why. Okay. Let me see. It's not coming up on Amazon. I think this book, I'm not sure if it's still in print or not. But let me just see. I had actually found it in a Google book search, and I wanted to pull up. You know what? Let me take a look to see if it's in books. Okay, it's sort of out of print. All right, but the name of the book that we'll be reviewing today is called In the Defense of Jehovah by Carl D. Franklin. Okay, so I'm going to share my screen with y'all, and we'll get into this. We're going to take a section of the book, and you'll see. Let me share my screen. Okay, here we go. And we can see the pagan origin of Yahweh that's in this book. It is said on page 5, it is a well-known fact that the Samaritans were transplanted to the land of Israel from the area of ancient Babylon. What is not well known is their connection with the ancient Amorites and their mutual god Yahweh. The Samaritans were descendants of the ancient Amorites and remained in the region of Babylon after the collapse of Dynasty I of Babylon. Mari, the name of their kingdom before Dynasty I of Babylon, was the name of their kingdom before the Dynasty I of Babylon. The god of the ancient Amorites was Yahweh, also variously spelled Yahweh, Yahweh, or Yahweh. This Amorite name was one of the many names of Nimrod. Wow. Nimrod was worshipped under different names by various cultures in the ancient Near East. The Amorites worshipped Nimrod as Yahweh, and Semiramis as Mari, later known as the Virgin Mary. Nimrod was known as Yahweh, and Semiramis as Anet or Aneth among the ancient Phoenicians. To the ancient Chaldeans, Semiramis was known as Maratu. The ancient Elamite Persians knew her as Maraham, and Horus, her son, who she claimed as Nimrod reborn as Jahi. Among the descendants of the Aram, the ancient Syrians, Horus was known as Yam, the serpent consort of Mary. The ancient Hebrews appropriated God's name, Adonai, and turned it into a sacred name for the worship of Horus. Adonai was said by the ancients to be the most holy of all sacred names of Horus. Semiramis was known by ancient Israel as Murrah. The people of Israel worship Adonai among the myrtle and myrrh groves, saying that he was the great Achad or Echad, the only one. Okay, so that's very interesting. We can see there, let me see if I could do a quick find on here. No, it doesn't allow me to do that right here. Let me see if I go further down. Okay, so let me just stop the share. And that's not anything that people who read the Bible should really be surprised about. Because in the Bible, it says that the God of Abraham was not the God of people who lived before the flood, right? And I think that is in the book of Joshua, chapter 24. Let me Google that. It's in the book of Joshua. Okay. And we're going to continue with the King James Version. I'm going to light this up. We're going to close here. Not close, but we're going to go into another biblical passage. Joshua chapter 24. All right. We'll start off with verse 1. And Joshua gathered all the tribes of Israel to Shechem and called for the elders of Israel and for their heads and for their judges and for their officers, and they presented themselves before God. Okay. And Joshua said unto all the people, Thus saith the Lord God of Israel, your fathers dwelt on the other side of the flood in old times, even Terah, the father of Abraham, the father of Nachor, and they served other gods. Okay. So people before the flood served other gods. And in this case with Abraham, I believe, is said to be a descendant of Nimrod through the mother's line, right? But Terah, his father, worshipped the Mesopotamian god, Nana, also known as Suin or even Sin. And so we can see that he was brought up in a certain type of household, but all those people that existed before the flood, the ancestors of Israel, they served other gods. You see what I'm saying? And so this is why you never hear in the Bible a reference to the God of Noah. You only hear the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob because a new covenant was made. And it was this Nimrod, because Nimrod is an archetype actually of two different personas, but definitely one of them includes Sargon the Great. So Sargon the Great was a great warrior, I mean, huge for his time. And this is who was typified, and possibly his son conjoined into the image of Nimrod, you see. So at that time, there was the belief of the cult of the dead, which is something that we discussed in previous videos. And the cult of the dead, basically, it represents ancestor worship. And ancestor worship was tremendously huge in that era. You see what I'm saying? And so this is something that is very unique among those things. Sargon of Akkad's influence is just purely astronomical. I came across this information in working on a book called The Genealogy of God. Most of that information in the book called The Genealogy of God now exists in the new text called the Moabitess Stone that's centered a little bit on Moorish science and some of the ideas that early Moorish leaders was trying to convey, like Noble Juali and etc. And the reason that this book was redesigned was because I felt that there was a lot of people, a lot of brothers who were seeking light, and a lot of them may not know what direction to go into. And I just thought the information was a very valuable and priceless source of information in this book called The Moabitess Stone that people can use in discovery of their own origins and find out the truth about history. There's an excerpt from the origin, the genealogy of God that exists on the Art of Nzugu blog page. I want to share that with you because it discusses in this chapter from the book, which now exists in the Moabitess Stone. I'll leave a link in the description. It discusses the depth of influence that Nimrod had in the ancient world, where some people even believe that he was the first Buddha. See, Buddha, as it exists today, we have to remember that it was a rediscovery of an old religion, which means that the Buddha, Gautama Buddha, was not the first person to be called a Buddha, right? And there were other Buddhas previously before him, and he admits that in his teachings. But knowing the history of the cult of the dead, we know that deities and even revered sages who were worshipped once walked as men, and you know they were revered as deities. So in this section, I want to share my screen with y'all once again. And I want to go over this section about the cult of the dead, you know, and its influence, and how does that tie in to Nimrod and his perceptions as being Yahweh. Okay, so in the middle of the page, you can see we found evidence of Buddha's association with Thoth early in our examination of the title of God. This must be an ancient correspondence indeed, for it would mean that the Egyptian Thoth was known in Asia as Buddha was known in Egypt. The worship of the dead, or the origin and nature of pagan idolatry, and its bearing upon the early history of Egypt and Babylonia by Colonel J. Garnier, published in 1909, states, the primitive or mythological Buddha is therefore identified with the prophetic God and the author of magic and sorcery of Western paganism, known under the name Thoth, Tortoise, Hermes, Mercury, Hea, Canes, the all-wise Belus, and the British Elu or Bud, whose human original was Cush. Okay. The evidence of this identification is, it will be seen, accumulative, while the fact that the origin of magic is traceable to the early Kushite inhabitants of the Euphrates and the Tigris valleys, whose language is so intimately allied with that of the Turian and Mongolian races who worship Buddha, leaves no doubt that he is the same as the prophetic god of the primitive Kushites or Akkadians. So let's pause here, for example. First, we note that the Kushites and the Akkadians, by ancient scholars, before white supremacy really hit the history books, was considered similar, the same stock of people. Let's continue on. But there is yet another reason why Buddha must be identified with those gods whose human original was Cush, the prophet and teacher of ancient paganism, the father of the Black or Ethiopian race, whose son Nimrod established shortly after the deluge the first great empire of the world in the valley of the Tigris and Euphrates. Let me go further. Buddha, although the chief god of the yellow race, is constantly represented as black with woolly hair and Negro features. The representation of Buddha at the period of Krishna, says colonel Todd, was Nina Nath. He is a black complexion, and his statues exactly resemble and features those of the young man Menon. His symbol was the snake. It has ever, says Ferguson, been one of the puzzles of the people of Buddhism that the founder of their religion should always have been represented in sculpture with woolly hair like that of a Negro. Buddha Jain, or Mahiman, says Mr. Farber, is perpetually represented by his Oriental worshippers with the complexion, the features, and the crisp hair of an African Negro, so that many have argued that Buddha must have been an Egyptian or Ethiopian, which is very interesting. And I want to move down a little bit more to discuss the primeval Buddha and how does this tie in with Nimrod. So when we go to Godfrey Higgins' work, his famous work, to Anacalypsis, Volume 1, it says, Mr. Umpham admits, as everyone must, the primeval Buddha of great antiquity, his existence, he does not attempt to explain, except so far as to admit that he was the son. Mr. Umpham's is the account of modern Buddhism. Okay, so in modern Buddhism, those things can be merged with saying that Buddha is the son. With this, I do not concern myself, except in some instances where the ancient truth hid under the modern trash seems to show itself, as for instance in the cycles noticed by Lubre and Cassini. From the lapse of time and other circumstances, the view of the Hindu avatars has become indistinct, yet they are still so visible that almost every Christian who has of late carefully looked into the early history of them is obliged to admit. Okay, Higgins explains how Nimrod inherited the titles of Buddha that existed long before his time. He continues, so this is the bold print that I'm going over. Thus, the Reverend Townsend says, as this incarnate being was considered a divine person and the Son of God, and as Nimrod claimed the authority and titles of the incarnate, it is evident that his father or his ancestor must, for some case, have been also considered as divine. I can have no doubt that Mr. Townsend is right and that Nimrod was Bala Rama, an avatar, probably Mahabela, or an avatar of Buddha. According to Higgins, Nimrod inherited titles of divine persons from ancestors, which shows existence of a primeval Buddha before the time of Babylon. This is something which, according to Higgins, Christians must admit after careful examination of early history. What history? Higgins then goes on to describe one of the most important events in human history, an archaic world war. It is from this war that a few tribes of India traveled from Southeast Asia to settle Babylon. Higgins continues, it is quite impossible to believe that all the striking marks of similarity between the names of towns, modes, or plans of building them, the names of persons, and the doctrines of the Oriental and the Western nations can have been the effect of accident. And I can see no other way of accounting for them than by supposing that they were brought by the first race of people who traveled westwards from India, and who all had, with various sectarian differences, fundamentally the same religion. and gave the same names to the towns as those they had left in their northeastern countries. This practice we know has always prevailed among immigrating people and prevails to this day. It rationally removes all the difficulties. It cannot be expected that at this late date, amidst the ruins of cities which have disappeared, we should find in each all of the traits or marks of the system. Okay, now I'm going to skip down to the second paragraph just to kind of clarify it up. It says, in the old books of the Hindus, as it was before stated, we meet with accounts of great battles which took place between the followers of Linga and those of Ioni, and that the latter in early times were expelled from India under the name Yavanas, after the sun had left Taurus and entered Aries, or about that time. It is probable that the war above alluded to arose. Whether the question of the precedence of the Linga or the Ioni had any connection with the transit from Taurus to Aries, I know not, but the two events appear to have taken place about the same time. The Buddhists or Yavanis were expelled, their priests were Chaldees, and they were Jains. They passed to the west in their way and built, or their sect prevailed in, the city of Baal, or Babylon. So we can see here that Nimrod's influence in the world was completely huge, and that his father, were some of the first peoples recorded to employ magic, you see. So it's more than likely that Nimrod will be revered as a king and as a deity. If we go further, I want to share my screen again to go further back into this, because how does this connect to Abraham? How does Nimrod connect to Abraham? Well, let's take a little deeper look. In the same article, because there's a lot of references there, so it's just easy to commend on. Where we see here how Nimrod poses as King Melchizedek, and we know that this is who Nimrod is. He's King Melchizedek. How do we discover this? Let's take a look at the text. It says, another obscure title of Nimrod as revealed in the unmasking of a very mysterious biblical character. For centuries, there has existed a great interest in discovering the identity of the priest of Salem. The personage of Melchizedek, however, is known. He is described as the king of Salem, who was recorded as blessing Abraham after his defeat of King Chedorlaomer. His description of king priest undoubtedly connects him with ancient Sumer and also reveals his identity. Hugh D. Santis in the book Beyond Progressive, an interpretive odyssey to the future states, all early civilizations from Sumer onward were ruled by a king or overlord. Indeed, the rulers of these societies were king priests, intermediaries between gods and the natural world. So Melchizedek was a person from Sumer, okay? Sumerians really wasn't under guidance of quote unquote Yahweh. If we was there wasn't under guidance of the God of the Bible, you understand what I'm saying? In the sense of how it's preached by Judaic fractions and Christian, right? But now that we know that Yahweh is Nimrod, his evolution, to becoming that is great. And so we see here how this King Melchizedek was a king priest. So evidently Melchizedek was one of the Sumerian kings, because that was a custom of Babylon, ancient Babylon and Sumeria. It continues. Let me go up a little bit. The mysterious King Melchizedek was none other than Nimrod himself. Genesis 14, 18 through 20 describes Melchizedek as follows. And Melchizedek, king of Salem, brought forth bread and wine, and he was the priest of the Most High God. And he blessed him and said, be blessed by Abraham. Be blessed, Abraham of the Most High God, possessor of heaven and earth. Be blessed by the Most High God, which have delivered thine enemies into thy hand. And he gave him tithes of all. Melchizedek was said to be a king priest, a very common attribute of ancient Mesopotamian rulers. Melchizedek offered Abraham bread and wine, which is symbolic of an initiation according to old Sumerian traditions. One example of the use of bread and wine as initiatory tools can be found in the Gilgamesh epics. Tim Ruin, in the book Wine and the Vine, and a historical geography of viticulture and the wine trade, states, the Epic of Gilgamesh provides us with two other pieces of evidence about the use of wine in early Sumerian society. The first concerns the taming of Enkidu, the wild man of nature, later to become Gilgamesh's inseparable companion. Enkidu is seduced by a harlot from the temple of love. Epics of Gilgamesh, 1960-99. Okay. Who later also introduces him to the pleasures of wine, saying to him, Enkidu, eat bread. It is the staff of life. Sound familiar? Drink the wine. It is the custom of the land. So he ate still. He was full and drank strong wine. 7 goblets. He became merry, his heart exalted, and his face shone. He rubbed down his matted hair of his body and anointed himself with oil. Enkidu had become a man. Enkidu thus becomes a man by eating bread and drinking wine, symbolizing the development of agriculture, which raised humanity above nature. The first use of wine mentioned in the Epic of Gilgamesh is following the hero's death, when bread offerings are made and libation of wine are poured out. But wine in its sacrificial role served at least 5 important symbolic functions. It symbolized the divine fluid. Red wine, similar in color to human blood, indicated or represented human sacrifice. Together with bread, it represented the first fruits of agriculture. It symbolized the hope of rebirth through its metaphorical connections with fertility rituals, and drinking of wine induced a sense of otherworldliness associated with being in the presence of gods. So the custom that Abraham was blessed with by King Melchizedek was a Sumerian custom. It could be traced to Sumerian history. It wasn't something coming from someplace out in space or some dimension called heaven. This was something that the Sumerians was doing for quite some time. And they took Abraham into their fold, which is why when Abraham is quoted, he's quoted as the God of Abraham is quoted as being the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. They don't talk about the God of Noah, because as we saw in Joshua chapter 24, the people who were Abraham's ancestors, they worship other gods. It says that in Joshua chapter 24. Okay, and we can see some of the actions by those deities was a little bit off the hook. Okay, so this completes our first section in establishing Nimrod and his evolution as Yahweh, which we'll further examine in part 2 of this discussion. This is Misal Bey, aka Warlock Asylum. I would like to thank each and every one of you for joining us here tonight. Have a great day.